the webinar at this present moment in time. So we've got an exciting 1.5 hours to talk about a number of different things on the subject of secularism, atheism, modernism, and our belief. So inshallah, let me just begin. First of all, let me introduce our first panelist, who is Hamza Andreas Tzortzis. And Hamza was converted to Islam in 2002. He is from Greek descent from a Catholic family, and he is a recognized popular speaker at university campuses, somebody who's quite known to many people. Hamza holds a master's and a postgraduate certificate in philosophy from the University of London, has spoken at many universities all around the world. Hamza has debated prominent academics and thinkers on Islam and atheism. His interlocutors have been people like, for example, Professor Lawrence Cross, Professor Peter Simons, Dan Barker, Professor Simon Blackburn. So he has over a decade of experience in articulating a compassionate and rational case for Islam. Now, Hamza is also the author of The Divine Reality, God, Islam, and the Mirage of Atheism. We will have a little chat with Hamza later on regarding this book that he's written. Our next panelist is Daniel Haqiqatjou, who was born in Houston, Texas. He attended Harvard University, where he majored in physics and minored in philosophy, and he completed a master's degree in philosophy at Tufts University, and he's a director of religion and scientism for the Yaqeen Institute. Now, Haqiqatjou also studies traditional Islamic sciences part-time, and he writes and lectures on contemporary issues surrounding Muslims, on modernity, life and culture. He is also a writer on critical analysis of the theories of biological evolution, which we'll talk about later on also. Now, Daniel has spoken at a number of universities, community centers and mosques in the US, and on subjects related to Islam, Islamic ethos, mentality. Furthermore, he has lectured and written critiques of secular liberalism, atheism, and has discussed on the topic of Muslims and their engagement with modernity. He's written some very interesting articles. I was reading an article not too long ago on why Trump is surprisingly good for Muslims. So that sort of probably sums up Daniel in terms of his general viewpoint about the world. But anyway, let's get into action. Let's begin initially by just throwing a couple of questions to the panel in terms of get a bit of a feel about their general take on a number of different things. Let's start with you, Daniel, first. You call yourself a Muslim skeptic.
Yes.
There's a bit of insight into what you mean by a Muslim skeptic and what's all that about.
Sure, absolutely. So usually skeptics are considered those who question religion, and they're seen as being committed to rationality and on the basis of rationality rejecting religion. But being a Muslim skeptic is to turn the tables and to kind of give skeptics and the opponents of religion a taste of their own medicine. And there's this really good quote that I like from G.K. Chesterton, who's an early 20th century English writer. And he says that the special mark of the modern world is not that it's skeptical, but that it's dogmatic without knowing it. Okay, so you see this kind of dogmatism in the modern world, but the modern world sees itself as supremely rational and supremely skeptical of traditional religion and just tradition in general, and especially Islam. So given this idea of the modern world considering itself supremely rational and being the opposite of dogmatic, the Muslim skeptic points out that in fact the opposite is true. All the modern ideologies that constitute what we know as modernities is just a series of dogmas. Okay, secularism, liberalism, capitalism, communism, feminism, and atheism. These are all dogmas that give the mirage or give the illusion of being supremely rational, and modern people, the denizens of modernity, so to speak, are blindly following this dogma. Okay, they're deluding themselves into thinking that they're rational and that they have discovered these timeless truths just through the workings of their pure reason, what they consider to be reason, okay? And so this is the position that they're coming from, to be skeptical of religion and Islam in particular. So the Muslim skeptic recognizes this modern self-delusion, okay, and questions these ideologies, questions them, critiques them, and shows the inconsistencies, shows where they diverge and differ from true reason, okay? And so, and then also the Muslim skeptic takes it a step further, because the Muslim skeptic, as believers, we should also present Islam as better, as more rational, okay, more intellectually consistent than these alternatives that the modern world claims to be the pinnacle and the height of reason and rationality. The Muslim skeptic does not accept this. The Muslim skeptic understands that the highest truth, the highest level of rationality is Islam and what has come to the Prophet, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in the Quran. Okay, and there's a hadith that I really love that really captures this, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was asked, who is in the way of Allah? You know, who is a mujahid? Who is doing true jihad? Okay, and I mean, there's many different areas of jihad, but in this particular hadith, the Prophet ﷺ explains that whosoever fights to make Allah's word the highest, okay, whosoever fights to make Allah's word the highest, then he is in the way of Allah. Okay, so this has been this is Sahih hadith, and I think it really captures the ethos of being a true Muslim skeptic and the kind of attitude that we need to confront these modern challenges that are presented to us as supposedly being the peak of rationality and morality and understanding.
Okay, right. Okay, that was a nice expansive response. You talked a bit about the mirage of atheism, or the illusion of atheism. Hamza, I'm going to point at you now. What's your understanding of the mirage of atheism? You seem to be talking a lot about the mirage of atheism in some of these sessions that you're doing up and down the country and abroad. Give us a bit of an insight about what this mirage is all about. You talked a bit about the mirage of atheism, or the illusion of atheism. Hamza, I'm going to point at you now. What's your understanding of the mirage of atheism? You seem to be talking a lot about the mirage of atheism in some of these sessions that you're doing up and down the country and abroad. Give us a bit of an insight about what this mirage is all about.
Well, basically a mirage is like an illusion in the desert. You're very thirsty and you think it's water and you want to quench your intellectual thirst. But if you are approaching down the path of atheism or the denial of the divine, all you're going to have is a mouthful of intellectual sand, and you're not going to quench your intellectual and spiritual thirst. And I'm a true believer in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I believe in the words of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And if you analyze the corpus of material that we have, namely the Quran, the Sunnah, and the Islamic intellectual tradition, you will see that atheism is irrational, atheism is unnatural, and atheism is imprudent and unwise, and it's not based on any form of certainty. And this is all derived from the book of Allah and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So atheism is unnatural from the point of view when Allah says in chapter 30, verse 30, that we were created on the fitrah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Fitrah, fatrun, fatarahu. We have something that's created within us to acknowledge Allah and to praise Allah. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in Sahih Hadith in Sahih Muslim, as narrated by Muslim, that every child is born in this state of fitrah, which essentially means acknowledging Allah and having this primary knowledge of wanting to praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, atheism therefore is unnatural because a deviation of the natural state. It's also imprudent and unwise. Allah makes it very clear. He says only a fool will reject the way of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Now, by extension, atheists not only reject monotheism, they reject any type of theism. So I wouldn't call them fools. Allah calls them fools, but in our language, I think that can mean imprudent and unwise for sure. Also, Allah says in the Quran in chapter 52, verse 35 to 36, بَلْ لَا يُوقِنُونَ. Indeed, they have no certainty, right? And these ayat are particularly referring to the kind of creative power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you look at this holistically, you see atheism is unnatural, it's imprudent and unwise, and it's not based on any certainty. And this for me would be the kind of Islamic description of the denial of the divine.
Interesting. So from the perspective that you give, the concept of a mirage, an illusion, we're hearing that there are those who basically are becoming atheists. There are Muslims who are actually becoming atheists.
Yes.
So Hamza, what would you say would be probably some of the most common reasons why somebody would go through some kind of episode in their life where they would actually think to themselves, you know, there is some doubt in this particular faith of Islam, and therefore I can see that there is a lot of evidence, or there is something there that which is very visible. I mean, just like you've explained that this is a mirage,
Sure.
but to them it's something very real.
Yeah.
And they then decide to become atheists or not to believe in God anymore. Why do you think these people are going through this particular journey?
Well, it's anecdotal evidence, and I can only speak from my limited experience. But the first thing I'm going to point out is this: is that if someone has had enough interaction with the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they've had a basic level of connection with Allah, and they become an atheist, that person is not an atheist for intellectual reasons. 100% is an atheist because of two main reasons: kibr and hawa. Kibr meaning arrogance and desires, okay? And I've seen this so many times. I travel the world and I speak to a lot of Muslims who become atheists, and basically when we speak for about 5 or 6 hours about intellectual arguments, at the end of the day, what comes out and what they admit is that, you know, I just want to live this life. It has nothing to do with intellectual discourse. And I've seen this so many times. And for me, I'm grateful for those experiences, because Allah has given me those experiences to show to me, look, fundamentally, if someone has had a basic level of understanding of Islam, they've had a basic connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and if they've left, then it's about kibr and desires. Now, that's one aspect. However, notwithstanding that, it's also very important to understand that a lot of the Muslims that decide to be skeptical or atheists, or they're really unsure about what to do in terms of how they're going to lead their lives and what ideas to adopt, many of those, unfortunately, have come from a background where Islam has not been taught at home. Islam was more like an ethno-religious identity. Islam, you know, people didn't know who Allah is. You know, I went to Pakistan a few years ago. I had people crying because they never knew that Allah will forgive them, right? You know, basic understanding of Allah's names and attributes and who Allah is and how to connect to Him, a basic understanding of the usuluddin. So unfortunately, a lot of our youth, particularly in the West, they're brought up by maybe, you know, first generation or migrant families that, generally speaking, may have not had a really good grasp of the Islamic tradition, and there was a construct at home that people didn't even know what Islam was about. So a lot of those people, they leave Islam because they don't know Islam. There's another group of Muslims who basically leave Islam because it's more of a psychological phenomenon. It's psychodynamic. I remember meeting a Muslim in my town, and he said he's an atheist, so he's an ex-Muslim. And the reason he said he was an ex-Muslim, because of his parents, because his parents brought him up in this kind of what I would call a socially dark world, a spiritually dark world. You know, there was no rahmah, there was no muhabba, there was no mercy and love. So we also have to understand that it's multi-causal. It is multi-causal. So that's why I had to make the first principle in the beginning, that if people have a connection with Allah, they've had a basic connection with Allah, and they basically have a basic understanding of the religion. If they've left Islam, my view is it's because of kibr, arrogance, and it's because of hawa, desires. And there are other elements, which is basically the social element. You know, we need to basically refine our understanding of Islam, start adopting the Quran and Sunnah and internalizing in our lives, and that can manifest in our behaviors and our actions and our state of being. So it helps our children grow to have the correct Islamic shakhsiyah, the Islamic personality. And that's very important for us to consider as well, because sometimes we always point the finger but I think we have to be balanced, that we also have to understand that we have something to address internally. And I know I've gone too long, but one more final point I want to make, which is we also have to understand that this is a political phenomenon. We live in a secular society. Secularism is really the political manifestation of atheism, and you have influential structures in society, such as the education system, such as the media, such as other constructs and influential pillars in society, and they're pushing that narrative. So if you're brought up within that, you know, arena, if you like, it's going to affect you in some way, because human beings are social beings, and generally speaking, human beings want certainty and they want to belong. In actual fact, the development of the social norm is as a result of us wanting to be certain and us wanting to belong. This is called informational social influence and normative social influence. So since human beings want to have certainty and human beings want to belong, if we're not giving that to them, this sense of belonging, this sense of certainty, they're going to find it outside. So that could be a problem too. And Allah knows best. These are just my limited insights.
Okay. Daniel, I can see that you're quite eager to get in there and present your side of why you think Muslims may be leaving Islam or going into atheism. Just before you do that, I just want to put an extra additional sort of component to this, and that is about a recent article that was made the claim that atheists on average are much more intelligent than people of faith. So just to add to that, what's your take on what Hamza just said?
Well, I agree with everything that Ustad Hamza just said. I think that there are many reasons why you find Muslims finding disbelief more compelling for them personally. I think what we're seeing a lot of demographically is not people of religion turning to atheism per se or agnosticism. Rather, a lot of individuals are becoming what are considered non-affiliated or nons, in the sense of they don't feel religion speaks to them or speaks to their life. They don't find religion relevant. They don't necessarily deny that God exists, but they still feel that organized religion, and especially Islam, does not meet their needs for life. And so this is how they distance themselves from Islam. And I think that's like a very big phenomenon in the US, at least. The statistics show that about 1 in 4 Muslims who are raised as Muslims end up leaving Islam when they become adults, or they no longer identify as Muslims. So this is a big issue. And I think that what contributes to that kind of view of religion as being irrelevant is, again, due to some of these modern ideologies. When you are taught, and this might speak to this kind of question of intelligence or education, when you go through a school system from age 4 until you graduate from college, and you have an educational system that is predicated on this view that God does not exist, or at most we can't know for sure that God exists, and there's this conflict between reason and between rationality and Islam, or rationality and religion. When you go through an educational system like this, and it's not just in the West, even in the Muslim world, that the curriculum is in large part based on Western curriculum, where again the curriculum is based on these ideologies, that at the center, at the core of it, is a denial of God and the truth of revelation. If you go through that, then of course, when you graduate, or as you go through it, you're going to be less inclined to think that God exists. You're going to be less inclined to think that religion is relevant. If you are fed a kind of modern ideology, like liberalism, that says that you don't need religion to be a good person. You don't need religion to know what is right and wrong, what is good and bad. You don't need religion to understand how to organize society and to organize your family, to organize your life. Religion is superfluous at best, and at worst, it's an obstacle towards you achieving, true freedom and true equality and true rationality. If this is what is being hammered into the heads of Muslims, okay, even Muslims who are going to Islamic schools. In some places, the curriculum is still the same. It's still a Western curriculum, but you have it's garnished with Arabic or, some very basic Islamic theology. You're going to come out of it being very disillusioned with religion. And even if you don't recognize it as disillusionment, you're disenchanted with Islam when you go through that. So I think this is what it affects everyone. This is in the water, so to speak, right? And so it just makes the Muslim community more likely to be convinced and find these kinds of atheistic arguments compelling, when in fact they're not compelling. And that's why we need to be able to do this work, this intellectual work of critiquing and deconstructing these ideologies in order to show people in general, not just Muslims, that look, you have to recognize the irrationality of rejecting God. You have to reject these ideologies because they lead to destruction, not only in the akhirah, but also in this life. And there are many arguments that can be made in that regard.
Okay. Just to get more sort of pragmatic and more practical about this, I have a number of imams that sometimes approach me, and they talk about Muslim individuals who are basically having doubts or becoming quite skeptical about certain aspects of Islam. Daniel, just going back to you, I mean, do people like that approach you, considering that this is one of your areas of interest? And do they, and if they do, what kind of advice do you normally give them?
You're saying if there are Muslims or imams that come?
They're Muslims. Muslims have just come to you because they have doubts about Islam.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a lot of Muslims that have come to me over the years with their doubts, and they're suffering from different shubuhat, where they're confused about, well, I read in the Quran something, or I read a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, and it just doesn't seem to me like this is rational. It doesn't seem to me that this is moral. So it might be something related to the treatment of women or the place of women in Islam and the Sharia. It might be related to non-Muslim issues like Ahlul Dhimma, or jihad or slavery or any number of issues. And in every single instance, it's the conflict is between what is read in the Quran or Hadith, Quran and Sunnah, and these modern ideologies that are just taken for granted as being true. Okay, there's a conflict with feminism. There's a conflict with secular liberalism. There's a conflict with scientism, right? How do we reconcile evolution in Islam? A lot of doubt is coming from this conflict that people are recognizing between Islam and evolution. So whenever I get questions like that, what I try to do is, okay, you're taking for granted these modern ideologies. Let's look more closely, okay, at those and see if they're consistent. Let's look more closely at those and see if they make sense. They're actually rational. Because if they're not, then we can dissolve the conflict, okay? If we can just clear the ground and make it an even playing field, okay? If you apply the same kind of skeptical attitude towards these ideologies that you're applying to Islam, then you'll find that those ideologies will crumble, okay? Yeah. Those ideologies are not going to be able to sustain the kind of minimal critique that you're applying to Islam. So let's turn the tables, okay? Let's turn the tables and apply those critiques so that then we'll have a level playing field, and then we can ask, okay, is Islam really the one that we need to be skeptical about in this scenario? And when I do that kind of exercise, it opens a lot of eyes and creates clarity, alhamdulillah. And it's something that it's not just what I'm doing. Anyone can do it, but it starts with this skeptical attitude, not taking for granted these ideologies that we are, being fed day in and day out in the world that we live.
Okay, Hamza, is that your approach to people like this? Do you sort of turn the table around and say, surely the skepticism should be bilateral. It should apply in both directions, not just against Islam. What's your approach?
Well, yeah, it's very similar. So basically what I try to do is go to the assumptions, because everything has assumptions. Everything starts with some first principles. So when they're thinking like, the evolution theory, it's absolutely true, which is a very kind of, non-academic understanding of the Darwinian mechanism anyway, but they'll come across because they've done maybe a very basic level reading, or they've read some popular books from some, so-called neo-atheists, and they think this is like, wow, it has to be absolutely true. And I just say to them, fine, well, what are your assumptions? Firstly, your assumptions are that you believe it's absolutely true. It's not. Secondly, let's understand the framework here. It's, probabilistic. It has its own assumptions, and it's based on disputes. Now, you don't even have to go into the nitty-gritty academia, but generally speaking, because sometimes people come from a premise of absolute certainty or a high degree of certainty. And if you show them actually what their assumptions are, and you deconstruct those assumptions, which their whole worldview is based upon, then that worldview itself will fall to the floor. But notwithstanding what I've said, from my limited experience, a lot of the times when people come up to me, it's because they just have an inferiority complex. I mean, I had this university student come up to me. He had one problem with one hadith, one prophetic tradition from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I just I unraveled it by basically saying, look, you've come to this hadith with the wrong lenses, because you think what the hadith is pointing to are direct empirical realities, and they're not. And he was so adamant that it had to be. And I was like, why? And just merely asking him that question really made him stand back thinking, yeah, you're right. I mean, why have I come to this hadith with this particular approach? And when you continue that conversation with them, usually compassionately and over tea and cake and stuff, they end up telling you the truth, or they show signs of that truth, which is, what? It's I have a complex. They must be right, because look at the West, it's amazing, and look at academia, right? So yeah, I would agree with the Ustad.
Okay, so let's say, for example, a child who's learning evolution at school, and clearly they've got certain ideas now in their mind, and they try to reconcile between what they're learning from school, what they're learning in some of these books, and they try to build a picture in terms of what the take is from the Islamic perspective on this. So Daniel, for somebody who's got a bit of a science background as well, how do you reconcile some of these so-called facts about evolution with Islam, and how do you sort of come to some kind of conclusion about this then?
Sure. I mean, there are different positions when it comes to Islam and evolution. There's clearly conflict, okay? Because if you believe that the first human being was born and had parents, okay, this contradicts clear-cut ayat of the Quran, right? And clear-cut statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the clear-cut understanding of centuries of ulama, okay, in our scholarly tradition. And that's why scholars have said that if you believe that Adam alayhi salam was born like a biological birth, then that actually constitutes kufr, okay? So we have to be really clear about that, because that's a clear conflict, okay? The scientific consensus is that it's not possible for a fully formed human being to just appear on the earth, right? But this is Islam, right? We know this is the history of mankind, that Adam and his spouse were descended onto the earth after Allah had sent them from Jannah. So this is something that clearly conflicts. And so how do we reconcile the conflict? So you can take a position, okay, if you just cannot imagine that science and Islam would ever conflict, then you can take the position that, okay, fine, evolution, it might be generally true for other non-human species, but when it comes to human beings, then we believe in, then we maintain the account in the Quran of the creation of Adam alayhi salam and what has been elaborated in the Sunnah and so forth. Okay, but when it comes to non-human species, then we're fine accepting evolutionary theory. This is the safe kind of view that you can take. But since you asked about my personal view, I think that this leaves a lot of this position leaves a lot of tension. Because you have this conflict, so how do you reconcile it overall? Either evolution has these problems or it doesn't. Okay, and so what I like to do is actually critique evolutionary theory, and when we delve into the details of what is often presented as indisputable scientific fact, empirical fact, you find when you actually read the scientific papers and even the discussion amongst evolutionists and evolutionary biologists, that there is a lot of unanswered questions. There's a lot of uncertainty about the different processes within the evolutionary scientific process. So I think Muslims need to be more critical of the actual evolutionary science, and there are non-Muslims that are already engaged in this kind of analysis that we can benefit from and we can contribute to. But if you have a kind of dogmatic view that there is no God, or only naturalism can explain the world around us, only natural causes can explain the origins of human beings, then you're not going to be inclined to, you're going to be blinded to seeing the different contradictions and questions and unanswered issues that exist within the actual scientific discipline. So one example is a major talking point amongst atheists and evolutionists against the religious, the Islamic history, is that human beings and chimpanzees share 99% genetic similarity. Okay, and they cite this claim as evidence that human beings and chimpanzees share a common ancestor, and this supports the idea of genealogical continuity, that all organisms are on the same family tree, and this kind of macroevolution, origin of species, has occurred contrary to what religion claims, contrary to what the Quran claims about the origins of human beings. But when you actually look at the scientific literature and you break down, okay, 99% similarity between two genomes, you find that actually this is just propaganda, in the sense that it's not actually based on a true comparison of the human and the chimp genome, and that so many, dozens and dozens of assumptions have gone into making that comparison to get that number of 99%, that it's just beyond belief how much has been cooked into producing that number. And I wrote a paper on that where I review over 50 different scientific papers from peer-reviewed journals, and I look at, okay, what is the actual science of comparing two genomes? And the impression that's given in public discourse and these kinds of superficial discussions that evolutionists have and present in saying, oh, it's hard science, it's indisputable science, they presented it very, very simplistically, as if you can hold two genomes in your hand and compare one to the other, and thereby say, oh, look how similar they are. But actually, there's so many assumptions baked into how do you actually compare, 3 billion sequences, okay, within the genetic sequence. And it's not as straightforward as all that. To such a degree that the people who even worked on the Human Genome Project, the director of that project came out and said around 2010 that actually there's no way to meaningfully compare two different genomes. It's actually an impossible thing to do. And people who say that two genomes are very similar are just speaking on the basis of cultural or ideological bias. And this is a man who is not speaking on behalf of a religion. He's not speaking as a believer. He's speaking as the director of the Human Genome Project, a multi-billion-dollar project. that was completed in the last decade. So I think that this is just an example of how there is a lot to question. There's a lot to research and see to undermines the evolutionist atheistic narrative that, the science is clear that evolution occurred in this way that we're describing it, in this kind of random, intentionless, mindless process of chemicals, just popping together, combining in a goo, and then suddenly you have, after a few 100 million years, human beings, right? So there's so much to contradict that narrative, and we as Muslims have to keep people honest. Okay, we have minds. Okay, we have scientific acumen. We should be able to read these papers and ask skeptical questions. And so that's my approach. I don't think that evolution is true, and I think that people can arrive at that conclusion from a very rational, reasoned basis. And in my work, I've been willing to defend that and to challenge those who disagree on a rational basis. So it's not dogmatic at all. It's just purely on the basis of your sources, which are the scientific papers.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember reading a survey not so long ago about, I think it was a number of people from the medical profession, and the idea was to get their understanding about whether they thought the evolution understanding as it's written in the books today is something which is true. And these were Muslims. They were Muslim physicians, doctors, and so forth. And apparently it came back as 60% of them actually believed it was true. Hamza, very briefly, we're getting a number of questions here from the audience, so I want to leave some time for the audience so that they get the opportunity. But just very quickly, how would you respond to somebody who's struggling to reconcile with the idea? We will have a separate session just on evolution in our sort of Atheism and Islam sort of a course in the very near future. But just very briefly, what's your sort of take on this idea of reconciling some of the things that you hear from teachers in books and TV, and there's regular articles in the paper and so forth? If you're bombarded by this kind of information on a regular basis, surely people start believing it to be true. What do you think?
Well, the approach that I take to speak about this issue is not even one of reconciliation. I start with the question that, do you even need to reconcile? Because if people study the philosophy of science, they would just understand that there's no major need to reconcile. You only need to reconcile if you're equating the theories, or even well-confirmed theories, you're equating, scientific conclusions with statements from Allah and His Messenger. And I'm like, well, you can't. By definition, they're two different sources of knowledge. Yes, and I know, and within that, you have different varying levels of sources of knowledge. But generally speaking, this is Allah's word. These are the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And these statements are a representation of the state of affairs, meaning they are true. Now, is science a representation of the state of affairs? So, are well-confirmed scientific theories, are they a representation of the state of affairs? Now, there's been a huge debate amongst the philosophy of science, or the philosophers of science. You have the instrumentalists, you have the realists, the anti-realists. I don't want to get into an academic discussion, but generally speaking, there was one group that basically said well-confirmed scientific theories are a representation of the state of affairs. They represent truth. And you have another group said that there are scientific theories that are well confirmed. They are just basically approximations of a representation of the state of affairs. Now, even to this date, there's still lots of academia going on and discussion, and they've come to the conclusion that even these things can change. Even something that they believe to be so well confirmed can change. So my approach would be, if you study Darwinian mechanism, this is a pixelated understanding of reality because it's a human product. Allah has the picture, we just have a pixel. Because we're never going to have an infinite number of observations of a particular phenomena, especially when it comes to complex theories like the Darwinian mechanism. So what I would like to do is say this, is that, look, the Darwinian mechanism is probabilistic, meaning it's generally speaking based on an inductive method. You may have a future observation or another observation that can contradict previous conclusions. It's based on assumptions. They have their own philosophical assumptions. If anyone reads, for example, a new field called the philosophy of biology, you will see there are some assumptions that they cannot prove, that they have to start with in order for the Darwinian mechanism to make sense. And also there are academic disputes about key areas of the Darwinian mechanism. Now, does this mean we reject it from a scientific point of view? Maybe no, we don't have to. You could be a Muslim scientist and just work with it, understanding it's probabilistic based on assumptions and it has disputes, and you don't put it into your creed because you know you have statements of Allah and His Messenger that are a true representation of reality, and what we're doing as human beings is basically just doing our best with the limited information that we have. We have a pixelated understanding of reality. You know, these are not direct observations. It's not like I'm seeing something is round, therefore I conclude it's round. It's much more than that. It's far more complex. So I think that's a powerful way of dealing with it. You don't have to even begin to reconcile. You just know what the epistemological positions are. Allah and His Messenger are the highest, and we have science, which is great, and we love it, and it's produced such amazing things, and it works, and it's beautiful. But we understand it's based on probabilistic framework, based on assumptions, and it has disputes. And you never know. In 10 years, even Richard Dawkins himself said, in 10 years, we may have something that doesn't look like the Darwinian mechanism. And this should humble us. The more knowledge we understand, even from a limited human perspective, we should know there's much more to know. And Allah knows best.
Yeah, so Darwinian sort of concepts are based on the issue of cause and effect. And there's a very naturalistic approach to understanding cause effect and effect as well, isn't there? So I suppose. Okay, so on a bigger note, looking at the bigger picture, I suppose one of the pivotal things that we could sort of put it down to is this idea of how we have revelation and we have reason, and there seems to be an apparent conflict between revelation and reason. Daniel, what's your grasp on conflicts between revelation and reason? And people do talk about there being conflicts. I'm not talking specifically about the theological in-depth discussions, even amongst the ulama, but rather from a perspective of a layperson who seems to believe that there are conflicts here. How do we sort of approach this idea of conflict?
Yeah, so it depends on what you consider to be reason, right? Because as far as the theology is concerned, there is no conflict between true reason and revelation correctly understood. Okay, there is no conflict between true reason and revelation correctly understood. So we don't have this kind of dichotomy or this kind of clash in Islam between reason and revelation that you find in certain modern religious traditions or Christian denominations. And we know this because Allah says, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ, right? Do you not reason? Allah asks repeatedly in the Quran, do you not reason? Do you not use your intellect? And so to be a true believer also means that you're exercising the height of your aql, of your rationality, of your reason. And there are many ayat that explicitly mention this, and this is how the scholars understood it throughout history as well. So whenever there is a conflict between reason and revelation, reason and Islam, it's always a seeming conflict. It only seems to be a conflict. There is no true conflict. The problem is that what people take to be as rational is not truly rational. Okay, what people today take it to be rationality is not true reason. And it's because they have, again, taken for granted these ideologies and not questioned their assumptions, not questioned and critiqued whether, okay, are these ideologies truly consistent? Are they truly as rational as they claim to be? And as I mentioned in my previous answer, once you do that kind of work, And it's not work that everyone can do, but certainly Muslim intellectuals who have studied in depth these ideologies at the academic level, they can do this kind of work of critiquing and undermining the supposed pillars of reason and rationality that exist today. And we should also be hopeful that this kind of work can be done because non-Muslims are already engaged in that kind of work. So ideologies like liberalism, okay, philosophical liberalism, philosophical secularism, these have been critiqued to death within the academic sphere. And some of those critiques we can endorse and we can learn from and we can benefit from. And the problem with academia is that once they have demolished some of these modernistic ideologies, they're left with nothing. They're left with a kind of nihilism because they also don't want to accept God. They don't want to accept religion as truth. They don't want to accept Islam as truth. So they are left with a kind of nihilistic view of the world where there is no truth, a kind of postmodernist view of truth in the world. So as Muslims, we don't have to opt for that kind of nihilism. We have the truth. We have Islam, so we can still benefit from that kind of work of, and we can contribute to it in our own ways in order to. Okay, you consider this to be reason and rationality? Well, actually, no. It's not what you think it is.
It's interesting how, even from the Islamic classical sort of literature perspective, some of the theologians like Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, he talks about the concept of the naql, which is transmitted knowledge, being sahih, and also aql, which is our reason, being sarih. And if then transmitted knowledge is sound and our reasoning is clear and has no external influences which are a detriment to it, then there will be no conflict. So he really presents a very good argument. And again, this is something that we'll be discussing in some of the future sessions. Okay, I've got a number of questions from a number of different people. We're going to give everybody about half an hour, so hopefully we'll try to pull out some of the questions from there. Before we do it, let's get a bit sort of more personal to you guys and talk a bit about something which you probably are more recognized for, some of your claims, or so people that you seem to be attracting, maybe for the right reason or the wrong reason. But start off with you, Daniel. You seem to be really causing a lot of sort of mass impact on feminists. And I'm not just talking about non-Muslim feminists, I'm talking about Muslim feminists. Do you want to just give us a bit of insight to that? What's going on here?
Yeah, I think feminism is one of the biggest, most powerful, most influential ideologies today that significantly impacts the faith of Muslims. Even Muslims who don't necessarily identify or call themselves feminists nonetheless are influenced by this kind of feminist ideology that, again, is taken for granted by traditional reformist, progressive Muslims all alike. Okay, and so this is extremely dangerous. This is extremely dangerous. There are the confusion that Muslims have who are falling into this ideology is that there are certain areas of feminism that overlap with Islam. Okay, for example, the treatment of women, respecting women, having respect and giving rights to women. These are all areas of overlap between feminism and Islam. But the problem is that you can't just focus on those overlaps and ignore all the larger conflict and all of the other problems that are created if you adopt a kind of feminist worldview or feminist ideology. And so the problem is that Muslims are seeing this overlap, and because feminism has so much currency in the world today, and because of this kind of inferiority complex that Ustad Hamza mentioned, they're adopting feminism, and they're calling themselves feminists, or they're at the very least staying silent about feminism because they don't want to offend very powerful feminists who control the political and social discourse. an academic discourse. And so what happens is they accept this ideology, they accept the usul of a feminist ideology, and that creates a lot of confusion and problems, because if you apply the feminist ideology and the principles, like the qawaid, if you can call it that, of feminism, then it will result in some very problematic conclusions. And so feminists, Muslim feminists go down this path of, it starts out by recognizing, well, there's mistreatment of women that I've seen. There's been a guy who was beating his wife, or there's a guy who was mistreating his wife, or the imam made a very sexist remark. So we need feminism to address this, okay? And they see feminism as a kind of answer to this, to these kinds of problems. When in fact, if you just go back to the Quran and Sunnah and you look at what the ulama have said about the treatment of women or the place of women and vis-a-vis the rights in Islam, you could address all those issues purely from using the sources within the Islamic tradition. But instead, you're adopting this foreign ideology, this modernistic ideology, thinking that it's the only way to address these issues, and then that puts you down a path. Because if you accept feminism, okay, or you accept the premises of feminism, one of the major premises, you can even say that one of the pillars of feminism is this idea of patriarchy as this kind of conspiracy of men who are out to control society in a way that benefits men and disadvantages and subjugates women. Okay, if you accept that, okay, that pillar of feminism, then you have to look at the majority of Islamic scholarship with suspicion. And in fact, you have to reject Islamic scholarship, because if you look at, clearly there were female scholars of Islam, and even the wives of the Prophet ﷺ were scholars and at that level of understanding, deep understanding in fiqh. But the majority of ulama within the history of Islam have been men. Okay, does this mean that these ulama have been controlling and subjugating women and preventing them in a kind of like an evil plot to just have their views only represented within the tradition and within the books, and they've just subverted women and sabotaged them so that their voices are not present? The feminist critique says, yes, that is the case with Islamic history. That's why Islam needs to be reformed. That's why we need to take out these patriarchal interpretations of Islam. And so that's why you see many Muslim feminists have deep problems with the Islamic tradition. But once you undermine the Islamic tradition in this way, then what are you left with as a Muslim? Okay, that is the core of our understanding of the deen, is what has been transmitted to us. Okay, the Quran has been transmitted through these scholars. Okay, even the Quran, like, not to mention hadith, not to mention all of the fiqh and the madhab, the kalam, all of this Islamic tradition has been transmitted by these men. So if you are undermining that from a feminist perspective, then you're undermining all of Islam. You're undermining the epistemology of Islam. Okay, so that's very extremely destructive. And so you see many of these Muslim feminists become more and more extreme in their rejection of Islam, and some of them end up even leaving Islam because they've accepted that ideology and its premises and worked it out to its logical conclusions. Okay, so given that danger, I dedicate a lot of time, and I'm very passionate about addressing feminism and showing Muslims that, look, open your eyes, like, look where this path leads. Okay, let's not be naive. Let's not be naive about what this ideology can do to not only individuals, but look at what it does to families. Look at what it does to societies. And there's a big historical aspect of it as well that I don't want to belabor in this short call, but feminism has been used as a weapon against Muslim societies historically for over 200 years. Feminism, one of the main tactics of the colonizers, was to go to Muslim societies and say, look at how you mistreat your women. Look at how you force them to veil. Look at how you force them to accept polygamy. Look at how you force them to take less inheritance. Okay, all of these things they would point to as a way to say that you are backwards, you are evil, you are hypocritical, and that's why you need to accept that your colonizers who will bring you the light of reason and will bring your society into the light of the modern world so that you can catch up with your superiors, Europe and the Western world at large. So we can't forget that history of feminist thought. And it's not something that was just in the past. Okay, feminism is being used today, okay, to do the same exact kind of colonization of the mind within the Muslim world. And third wave feminists, okay, are equally guilty of this because they try to subvert Islamic sexual ethics, Islamic views of gender, okay? And so they're also disrupting Muslim society through, whether it's through the NGO, going to the Muslim world, setting up camp, like recruiting people, distributing literature, and trying to condition Muslims that, look, your religion is backwards because it doesn't accept same-sex behavior. Your religion is backwards because it doesn't accept transgendered ethics. So this is a continuous process. All through feminism and secular liberalism, we have to get rid of this naivete that we're suffering from and not shy away from critiquing feminism and pushing back and saying, no, we don't accept this. This is very problematic. Yes, it's important that we give women rights, but rights as Islam defines it, rights as Allah has defined it, and the Prophet ﷺ has taught what rights women have, wives, daughters, what rights husbands, sons, etc., what rights people have. Okay, our religion defines this for us, okay, with utmost eloquence. Allah defines this for us in clear language. We need to stick to that. We need to hold on to that and not adopt this foreign ideology that is meant to disrupt and destroy. And yeah, so I get very emotional about this topic.
Okay, this is a place to get emotional, alhamdulillah. Now, talking about this, I remember talking to an Islamic psychologist not too long ago, and he was talking about one of the main reasons why he feels that a lot of people are undergoing depression and sort of psychological trauma is because of this concept of fitra, which is one way to describe that would be the concept of the dynamics of a family, the dynamics of society, that, you know, we're living in a time where the dynamics are not in line with our fitra. So, Hamza, you talk a lot about this, don't you? You talk a lot about the argument from the fitra perspective. You want to give us a bit of an insight? This is something very personal to you. Do you want to give us a bit of an insight about your fitra? As I'm doing this, by the way, for those of you who are watching, I am addressing a lot of your questions. A lot of your questions are very clearly related to some of the answers that we're getting from Daniel and Hamza. So, you know, I am, even though I'm not quoting your questions, they are being addressed. Hamza, it's all yours.
I mean, the fitra argument has been elaborated on by many of the ulama, and there has been, just to give a sense of intellectual fairness, there has been a wide range of opinions on the fitra in our tradition across the schools of creed. But notwithstanding that, I think reviving this idea of the fitra can be very, very powerful, because there is no such thing as a first principles or a metaphysics free worldview. And I think it's very important for us to understand that and to see where our first principles lie. And I think from an Islamic point of view, our first principle lie in the idea of the fitrah. Now, the fitrah is very interesting because it's this innate disposition that Allah has created within us, this innate nature that is based on two main things, which is the fact that we have a proto-knowledge, a primary knowledge of acknowledging Allah, and also a primary knowledge of wanting to praise Him. And what is very interesting is when the Prophet ﷺ in the early morning at Fajr time, when he would hear the nearby towns giving the adhan, when they said Allahu Akbar, he would basically say this is fitrah. And when they continued the adhan, he said this is Islam. So there is an interesting sense that praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is really deeply rooted in the human psyche. And you see this when we praise poets and we praise, you know, athletes. We have this need within us that we give praise to someone because we notice attributes in them that deserve due praise. Now, so that's the basic idea. Now, there is another element that some ulama spoke about, which is we also have a kind of ingrained understanding of, you know, objective virtues, objective morals, you know, a sense of what is the good life, to put in liberal language, right? So if that is the fitrah, that you have this acknowledgement of Allah, the fact that He deserves praise, and you have a basic understanding of some fundamental moral virtues and what is the good life, and all of that aligns with Islam, then a pure fitrah, or a fitrah that is not clouded, would be able to acknowledge Islam when it sees it. Now, according to the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Sahih Muslim, that the Prophet said that every child is born in a state of fitrah, however, it's parenting that changes the child. Now, many ulama said this is the effects of socialization. Now, if you go deeper into Islamic psychology and even in Islamic epistemology, which is all very linked, by the way, the aql and the qalb and the ruh and all of and the fitrah all kind of intertwined. There's lots of different discussions amongst our ulama. But the point here is that the fitrah is changed from socialization, and the fitrah could be clouded. Now, our job, therefore, as du'at or as, you know, Muslims, is to help uncloud other people's fitrah. Now, what can uncloud someone's fitrah? It could be rational arguments. It could be a spiritual experience. It could be a negative experience, and we have this idea in the Quran itself. So there are different means to uncloud the fitrah so it can awaken the truth within. It is an interesting idea, but I think it really makes sense of even our ability to have reason. It makes sense of Islam comprehensively. It makes sense of understanding of different levels of yaqeen, certainty in the Islamic tradition, you know, haqq al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen, ilm al-yaqeen, all of these things. And it's an amazing first principle, it's an amazing metaphysic on how to see the whole world. And it allows you to see reality in a comprehensive way that is far more consistent. And so I think, you know, the more we study the fitrah, the more we understand the role of reason as well, and the role of other things. Because sometimes we have to understand that, you know, it's not always going to be a rational algorithm that you put together and it's going to lead to iman and hidayah. No, it won't. It might be. It just might be someone started to pray like a Muslim, and that spiritual experience unclouded his fitrah or her fitrah, and the truth within would just shine through. So it might be that. So I would agree with the psychologist from that point of view. You know, Allah says, if you forget Allah, Allah will make you forget your own selves. And I think that's what's been happening in a post-modern society, is that many of us are forgetting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Interestingly, Nietzsche actually said this: if you forget God, you know, you're going to have nihilism from that point of view. And when he said God is dead, he didn't really believe that there is no God. He was making a judgment. He was making a prophecy. He said, when Europe denies God in their hearts, they don't live like God does. They live like God doesn't exist anymore. They're gonna have to realize that they have to base, you know, their morality on something that is not grounded rationally. And then yeah, anyway, that's a different topic. But anyway, so there you go. There's my fitrah piece. We'll have to discuss this at length later, because it's a detailed discussion that links to so many different other things.
Okay. Just going back to some of these questions, 2 to 3 questions sort of addressing the idea of how Islam is presented. There's a couple of claims, a couple of questions, certain statements have been made by some of our audience. I'll just read out one particular one. Some people experience a lot of cognitive dissonance. When we go to the masjid, the imam, no offense here, yells, gets emotional, and waves his arms about for no reason. When we go to a university or speak to an atheist, they seem much more educated and rational. Religious sermons make me feel like I've gone back in time 500 years. Is there something about how we present Islam? Is that problematic? Is there maybe?
Well, let me just say, it would be great if we could go back 500 years.
Yeah.
That's not, yeah. But go ahead. What were you saying?
Yeah. So I mean, is there something about how we present Islam? I mean, Hamza, join in. This is open to both of you. Something about how we're presenting Islam, maybe is it problematic the way we're presenting Islam? Or is it the fact that people are going to the wrong channels to gain the knowledge of Islam?
Yeah, what's wrong with a bit of passion though? I mean, even the Western existentialist would say, if you're not passionate, you don't have life. You know, there's a Greek saying we say in my culture, which is, you know, isexenerodos, which means you lack a life passion. You know, I mean, if an imam is speaking with passion and is coming from his heart, then what's wrong with that? I mean, but notwithstanding that, we have to understand that our Islamic tradition has a whole load of ethics and rules concerning how we portray Islam to others. Yes, we have to be compassionate, a sense of rahmah. We have to use hikmah. But hikmah means the Quran and Sunnah. It doesn't mean your own limited rationalization of what hikmah is. Right? So we have to use reason and rationality and mercy. You know, a famous ayah in the Quran when Allah says about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he says, if you were harsh-hearted with them, meaning the Sahaba, the best people, they would have run away from you. But, you know, it was from the mercy of Allah that he gave you this softness, he gave you this rahmah. And also, if you look at Musa alayhi salam, when he was speaking to Fir'aun, one of the worst creatures, right? Fir'aun. Allah says, layyina, to speak with soft speech. Obviously, I understand there's wider rulings on if someone is a continual hater and after the first time you've been really nice, you need to adopt different strategies. I appreciate that. But aslan, foundationally, we have to be people of muhabba, of rahmah. You know, there's this Sahih hadith which is narrated by Bukhari and you can find it in Tarikh al-Kabir, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, love for linnas. It's not akhihi, that's a different hadith. It's love for linnas, love for humanity, we love for yourself. So if we love Allah and His Messenger the most, then we should give that love to humanity. And the best way to do that in the beginning, is to do it with rahmah, with love, with mercy, with compassion, not having much ego, with humility. But do understand as well, when it comes to ideologues, there's a different fiqh, there's a different jurisprudence, if you like. But I haven't studied it, so I don't want to make any assertions here.
Yeah,
Okay.
and also I did add to that it depends on the context. Just to emphasize that point is that if I'm speaking, or if there's someone who's speaking one-on-one with a person, then of course it's important to be gentle. It's important to speak with a person in a way that they understand, in a language that they understand. But then there's other contexts. Sometimes mercy requires, you know, tough love. Sometimes mercy requires being very direct and being uncompromising on certain issues. And we see that in the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him as well. Not everything was diplomacy, okay? Everything was mercy, okay, that the Prophet ﷺ brought. Everything was mercy, but sometimes, even if you're a parent, you recognize this, that different contexts require a different tone, right? And this is something that I'm often criticized for, is being passionate and sometimes being very aggressive or being undiplomatic. And there are others like this as well. And I think that we shouldn't, as Ustad Hamza mentioned at the beginning of his response, passion is important. Okay, we have to be able to express sometimes our shock at the state of the world around us. And we should be able to speak to that and show that this is not right. We have a better way. We have a different way. And we express that with hikmah, we reason and we debate. But there's no problem with being passionate and being able to, in some cases, be undiplomatic and being very solid and strong on the haqq.
Okay. I've got a little question there's about 2 to 3 questions that address the same kind of point. There's something about the cosmological argument for God, the teleological argument, the ontological argument for God, the moral argument for God, all these different arguments for God. It's all an appeal to reason. And somebody could argue and say, well, you know, Islam is a leap of faith. Hamza, just going back to your understanding of fitrah, and, you know, why, if we were not born, and you were not born in a Muslim home yourself, but if we are not born in a Muslim home, what is it that really appeals to non-Muslims to become Muslim? What really catches them? What are the main reasons why they decide to become Muslim?
Well, for everyone it's different. The whole model of the fitrah that I've just tried to elaborate on, it could be anything that unclouds the fitrah and it awakens the truth within. It might not even be rational arguments. It may be, you know, a spiritual experience or whatever the case may be. But don't get me wrong, it's important to have everything together in its right context, which includes the role of reason as well. But I give you an example. I think one powerful way of showing why non-Muslims, would find Islam very appealing, is because everyone is in a state of worship. Now, if you give people the comprehensive understanding of ibadah, of worship, it's basically to know Allah, to love Allah, to obey Allah, and to direct all acts of worship to Allah alone. Now, if you want to break this in its logical components, it's basically to know something the most, to love something the most, to obey something the most, and to direct your acts of worship like gratitude towards the most. Now, every human being is in that state. It's the human being always is knowing something the most, whatever that is. It could be, I don't know, a celebrity, right? If you want to use a crude example, they love something the most. It could be their partner. It could be their own ego. They always are obeying something the most, or obeying multiple things the most, and they're showing gratitude towards something the most as well. So by definition, they're in a state of worship. What does Islam say? Islam basically says to truly free yourself from the shackles of false worship and worship the one that deserves worship. And if you truly show people who Allah is, just literally who Allah is, his names and attributes, I'm telling you, if someone sincere, that is enough to awaken the fitrah. It's enough to uncloud the fitrah so they can awaken the truth within. And I've seen this many times with people who think and people who are really rational. And this is based on an ayah in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, consider the state of two people. One person, he's a slave to many masters and they're all quarreling. And another person is a slave to one master. Whose condition is best? So Allah is saying to humanity with eloquence, saying to humanity, you're in a state of worship anyway. You think you're free. You're not free. You didn't choose your birth. You didn't choose your gender. You didn't choose your ethnicity, your DNA, your social context, your first school, your first clothes. You didn't even choose your parents or your siblings. And you're saying you're free? And basically what Allah is saying is you're always going to be in the state of, you're going to have these shackles. But Allah is saying when you break those shackles and you enslave yourself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to know him the most, to love him the most, and to obey him the most, and to direct all your acts of worship like gratitude and prayer towards the most, then that will truly free you from the point of view that the word for soul in Arabic is ruh, and it shares the same root as the word raha, which means ease and liberty and serenity. So true serenity and ease comes through the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now one would argue that's not a rational argument, it's an existential argument. So what? The point is that is so appealing to a rational mind because they see the state of being in the world, which is, well, in actual fact, I am worshipping something by that definition. Do those things deserve worship? No. Well, let me read about who Allah is. That being deserves worship, absolutely. And that's a very profound argument. Now, it could be that. It could be the contingency argument that brings someone to Islam. Who knows? But the point is, I think it's also very powerful for us to use these Quranic arguments that are deeply existential. And in a way, they transcend a kind of traditional rationalism. It doesn't mean they're irrational. It depends how you define rationality. But they transcended traditional rationalism. What I mean by traditional is not Islamic. I mean Western traditional rationalism. And they really focus at the core state of being of the human being. Many intellectuals have become Muslim just because of this point. But by the way, there are so many other reasons too.
Okay. Just a couple of questions again. Sort of pile them together and I'll put them to you both. The question of evil, theodicy. I can see that a lot of our audience are talking about a number of different things related to life events that they've had, things that they see around the world, evil acts around the world. Surely if there is a merciful God, why is there so much evil in the world? Why has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, created a world where such evil exists, considering that he's Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim? Open to both of you. Any kind of response you could give to that? I know, Hamza, you've written your book. You want to tell us a bit about your book and maybe how you address this in your book?
Well, forget the book. This is focused on arguments. I mean, a lot of the chapters are free on my website now anyway, so the book's irrelevant. What's important is the argument. And I truly believe this is an emotional argument. It's not intellectual in any shape or form. I would even argue it comes from a psychological position of egocentrism, which is a cognitive bias that Allah has to see things the way the human being sees things. Like egocentrism is like Ustad Daniel has to see the way Hamza sees the way, right? Has to see reality the way Hamza sees reality. That's egocentrism, right? And the reason I'm saying this is because what they do is they assume Allah is only powerful and only merciful or loving. It's a logical fallacy. It's a straw man. They are representing Allah as someone or something or a being that is it's not who he is. For example, they're saying Allah is good and powerful. If he's good and powerful, then he should be able to stop the evil and he should want to intend to stop the evil. But there's a fundamental problem with that argument. It's based on a false assumption that Allah is only good and all powerful. Because if you include, for example, Allah is Al-Hakim, He's Al-Alim, Allah has the totality of wisdom and knowledge, Allah is the knowing, He is the wise, then automatically it breaks down that argument, because it shows that there is now a wisdom or a divine reason for why evil has happened, that you can now reconcile with the fact that He's also merciful and powerful. So logically, it doesn't even logically follow. It's a purely emotional argument. And I remember giving this, when I was doing my postgrad, I was speaking to an atheist, and he was like, oh, God's wisdom, that's such a cop-out. I was like, hold on a second. It's not a cop-out. He said, but I can't see the wisdom kind of thing. Yeah, but that's a logical fallacy too. It's called argumentum ad ignoratium. Just because you can't see the wisdom or understand that there is a reason behind something, it doesn't follow that there is no reason. And I said, but it's not just about that. We're talking about who the divine is. You've started with a wrong definition of the divine, that He's only good and powerful. If that was the case, then yeah, you're right. Why is there evil? As David Hume said, right? And he quotes Epicurus. Of course, why? But Allah is not only good and powerful, He's also the wise. And I was saying to him, it's not a cop-out, because you submit to people's wisdom all the time. Why are you raising your epistemic bar so high now? And the reason you're doing that is not because of an intellectual argument. There's a psychological issue going on. Because you submit to wisdom all the time. When you're on a plane and the pilot says, there's going to be heavy turbulence, please buckle up. And, what do? You buckle up, you put your seatbelt on. You're not going to start doing the Michael Jackson moonwalk on the aisle, because, you may know nothing about turbulence, but you're going to submit to the pilot because he has a wisdom and an authority that you don't have, i.e. knowledge of turbulence. Similarly, when you go to the doctor and you give them a whole set of symptoms, and they say, you have this disease, take this medicine, you're not now going to say, no, you're wrong, what do you know? You submit to their authority and their wisdom. Now, who is the greater authority? It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what I wanted to show to the atheists is that this idea of wisdom is not a cop-out, because we have it in all aspects of our lives too. Anyway, to cut long story short, this argument is based on a false assumption that Allah is only good and all powerful, but He's also the wise, and that basically reconciles any evil or suffering. Another assumption this argument is based on is that Allah hasn't given us any reasons in the Quran and Sunnah why He's allowed evil in the first place. And if you just look at the Quran and Sunnah, it tells you why there's evil and suffering. This is not paradise. We're not here to party. We're here to worship Allah, to love Allah, to know Allah, to obey Allah. And we're going to be tested. In chapter 67 of the Quran, Allah says that He created life and death in order to test us on who's best indeed. So there is an array of reasons that Allah actually gives us. So, in summary, the problem of evil argument, I don't think is a powerful argument, namely because it's a misrepresentation of the divine. Allah is also the wise, is not only good and all powerful. We don't abstract Allah's names and attributes, we see them, but all why His oneness together. So they misrepresent Allah. Secondly, they assume that Allah hasn't given us any good reasons why there's evil and suffering in the first place. And Allah has, if you just study the Quran and the prophetic traditions. So I think it's a really poor argument.
No, I agree. It's a very poor argument, and it is very emotional. And it's easy to turn it on its head as well, because you can ask an atheist that, okay, if you believe that there is no afterlife, there is no final judgment, there is no last day, then are you comfortable with the fact that there has been great evil that has been committed by human beings who then will not be held to account? Like, is this supposed to be make you feel comfortable? Because if you feel uncomfortable with this idea of there being God and there being evil in the world, then you should be even more uncomfortable and more unsettled by the idea that there is extreme wretched evil that exists in the world that will never be resolved and people will not be held into account. So that's not a viable alternative that you're presenting, contrary to religion. And then also there's an amazing statement of the Prophet ﷺ where he says that if the world to Allah were equal to a mosquito's wing, then he would not allow disbelievers to even have a sip of water from it, which is to say that the world is even less worth, has even less value than that of the wing of a mosquito. And so we can understand from this that the suffering or the pain that we as individuals or others might go through in life, and everyone is going through pain and suffering in some capacity, this is just a temporary situation that we're in. And life, we have to go through life as a traveler. Our final goal is Allah. Our final goal is the Akhirah. And as Ustad Hamza eloquently put it, this is a test, and we have to see we have to strive our utmost to do good and to help others and to worship Allah. And then these kinds of pains and difficulties and evil, that Allah has also created evil. As he says in the Quran, these are tests that we have to overcome, and we cannot lose faith, we cannot lose our iman due to those kinds of tests.
Okay, one last final question to both of you again. Before I put that forward, there's another question that's here. I just thought I'd mention it to Hamza. Somebody wants to know where you got that poster from on the back and on your wall.
It was.
You don't need to tell us.
Actually, it's a painting from my brother-in-law.
Right. Alhamdulillah. Okay. Right. So the last question is regarding, and there's a number of people who are on the in the audience who are asking about what advice you would give them, because they teach children. They teach Muslim children regularly on a regular basis throughout the week, about how they can introduce into their general curriculum some of these really important things about modernity, about feminism, about secularism, about evolution, how they can incorporate that into the syllabus so that they have a balanced account about what truth is and what Islam is saying regarding that. What advice would you give them?
Well, I can start. I think before introducing information into a curriculum, you have to learn it yourself, and you have to be comfortable yourself with critiquing these ideologies. Because if you don't feel comfortable yourself, you're not going to be able to withstand the kinds of questioning and challenges that children and youth will put to you. So that would be the first step, is for not only your role as a teacher, but also your role as a Muslim and a believer. You should be able to satisfy yourself intellectually to the teachings of Islam. And wherever you find a question or a doubt, you need to address that before it grows into something that is unmanageable. So that's a very personal journey that we all have to take. Alhamdulillah, there's increasingly more material online and through institutes and teaching that provides those kinds of answers. So you need to dedicate yourself to learning and be proactive in that, and not let a situation arise where you're put into a tough spot because a student has asked you a difficult question. Rather, first educate yourself. And then also you can go and once you've done that, then you'll know what kind of material your students will need to learn from. And, you mentioned at the introduction of the conference call, I'm with the Yaqeen Institute. I'm no longer with the Yaqeen Institute, but, you can definitely check out their work. They have a lot of material on different questions. I know that Ustad Hamza has his own institute and his book. I highly recommend you read it. I have it on my desk right here, Divine Reality. And also I have a website, muslimskeptic.com, which addresses a lot of the issues and challenges from modernism and feminism, liberalism, secularism, and so forth.
Hamza?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to do is, first give them a grounding as well. I think it's very important for them to first understand, why does Allah deserve worship? Who Allah is? What does Islam say about the role of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there are so many evidences in the Quran and the Sunnah in our intellectual tradition to give them that good grounding, even on a very simple level. Once that's done, then they're able to now to address other ideologies that are antithetical to the Islamic worldview and tradition. I think that's an important way of doing it, because sometimes people just start with, refuting ideologies, and then, their kind of foundations are not there. And what I mean by foundations, they don't have to be scholars, but there is, we've planted that seed that's there, that they have that connection with Allah. They know who He is. They know why the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a prophet and why he was the final prophet. They know why the Quran is from Allah. They know who Allah is, and that is in their hearts and their minds, and they've internalized that to a certain degree. Once that's there, then you can start teaching youth about the false assumptions of particular worldviews, the false assumptions of even a popular understanding of a particular worldview, and that will be very important for them, because we can't be on the back foot anymore. We have to create leaders. We have no choice, because we don't have the political social constructs to basically come across as a massive intellectual and social force. That's not, we're minorities living in our countries, and what we need to do is basically create leaders. And the way to do that is by really waking up and getting our ulama and our teachers to basically address these fundamental issues. If they don't, then we're doing a huge disservice to them, a massive disservice to them. We just had 15 imams and scholars from Canada come to us, and we spent around 8 days with them just to try and empower them with some of these issues. And they're faced with a tsunami of questions and doubts. Alhamdulillah, they're a little bit more well equipped now, but it's not just a 7-day thing. We have to be in this until we meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We, from this day there is no rest. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have in the West, is to basically have that kind of intellectual spiritual force. Allah says in the Quran to struggle with it. Bihi. What does the bihi mean here? It means with it, meaning the Quran itself. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya said this is the highest form of struggle, to struggle with the Quran. Now, this doesn't mean you're getting the Quran and you're hitting on people's heads, by the way. You're literally struggling with the intellectual force and spiritual force of Islam and of the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's the highest level, according to many of the ulama. So I think it's very important for us to revive. Look, let me just be honest with you guys. We are standing on the shoulders of giants, right? This was done, I'm a huge lover of Al-Ghazali, right? If you read all of his works, he was, for me, subhanAllah, he has so much to say for us in our times, wallahi. And may Allah have mercy on him. And I'm also a fan of Ibn Taymiyyah as well, from the Fitri perspective. And we are standing on the shoulders of giants. What we need to do is to learn to make contemporary what they said. I'm telling you, because when you just look into the tradition, like, oh my God, that's a brilliant argument. That's an amazing principle. Yes, that's fantastic. It's all there in our tradition. I don't want people thinking that we have to reinvent, a new intellectual tradition. No, it's already there in our past. All we have to do is simply take what was there and make it more contemporary and apply it in our times. And I think if you understand that point, you shouldn't be worried. There's hope. And I really believe a lot of good things are going to be happening. We just have to understand where we came from, who we are now, and what we need to be. And inshallah, Allah is with the believers.
I very much agree also on the basics, because the level of Islamic literacy is very low, unfortunately. I taught Islamic school for a few years, and these were students who were going to Islamic school since kindergarten. And then they're at the high school level, and they didn't know kind of the basics of Iman, the pillars of Iman. They didn't know what the meaning of Surah Al-Fatiha. They didn't know even what La ilaha illallah means. They knew it was a pillar of Islam. The 5 pillars are really emphasized, but beyond that, they didn't know the basic meaning of it. So the level of Islamic literacy amongst youth and adults as well is very low. And if you don't have that kind of foundation, then how are you going to be in a position to address some of these intellectual challenges? And another thing is that the education of youth doesn't start with Islamic school. It has to start much, much earlier. Okay, even at the level as soon as a child is learning how to speak, and even before learning how to speak, we need to be mentioning Allah. We need to be mentioning the name of the Prophet ﷺ and sending peace and blessings upon him before a child is even able to speak, because language and words, and this is what we know within Islam, they have an influence, a deep impact on the cognition and the psychology of children. And so if they're surrounded, hearing the words of Allah, hearing the Quran, hearing the name of the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, then this is going to incline them later to have the cognitive capacity to accept and better understand the deen. And I caught myself in a funny example. I have a 5-year-old, and he asked me, actually when he was 3 years old, he asked me, well, where is rain coming from? Okay, where is this water from the sky coming from? And then, I have a science background, but I began explaining the water cycle to him. And then I caught myself. I was like, SubhanAllah, why am I telling him about the water cycle? I need to be mentioning Allah. I need to be mentioning Allah's control over the samawat and the malaika, and how, Allah commands the angels to bring down the water. And so this is the reality. Okay, this is the core reality that needs to be conveyed to children from a young age. I'm not saying that the water cycle is invalid or the scientific description is not valid. Yes, but that's just a secondary or tertiary description. But the actual reality is described by Allah. The actual reality is described by the Prophet, peace be upon him. And that's what we need to convey, so that our children are oriented to Islam. They're oriented to the Haqq. They're oriented to the Quran. And they're going to be more, when they have this conceptual framework built through this teaching and this inculcation of values and truth, then they're going to be in a much better position when they go into Islamic school, when they face a world that is, by all accounts, hostile and antagonistic to Islam. So we have to give them a step up. We have to give them all the advantages that they can have, starting, even less than 1 year of age.
Okay, like all good things, they must come to an end. So we're now towards the end of our webinar. So first of all, I would like to thank Brother Hamza and Brother Daniel for your time. Some very valuable bits of advice, and it was really interested to really start poking your mind and getting some of this information from you and some knowledge about some of these areas. You guys are very active in this field, so inshallah, hopefully we can all learn from this. There's a number of different questions that have been put forward. There's been a lot of thanks and praise for both of you for your contribution, there's just highlight a couple of things. There will be a recording of this available to all. It's free, and also some of the questions that we have, we will take them back, and some of them we can give you some response to them in time. But more importantly, there's been a number of questions. There's been something about scientism. There's been something about atheism. There's been some questions about theodicy and the question of evil, and a number of different questions here, clearly which we're not really able to respond to in such a short session. However, we have a course. For those of you who are not aware, we have a course on Islam, Atheism and Islam, and we have a number of speakers on this course. There's approximately 14 speakers altogether. However, each one of them has a particular specialist interest in different areas. So hopefully we can cover this whole subject quite holistically. And there's a number of different course aims and objectives, mainly to describe the Islamic theological and the philosophical, social, as well as the historical perspective to contemporary understanding of atheism, as well as the principles of Islamic theology as a basis to challenge misconceptions and provide polemical defense and attack, as we've already talked about in this particular webinar. There's also something about providing Islamic narratives on some of the challenging concepts. And you've already heard two panelists sort of give two really interesting perspectives to the same question. So there needs to be a platform for this. And these speakers will give us the opportunity to listen to them and even for us to have present our questions, our doubts, and whatever to these people. Also to provide a forum of interpersonal contact between the Muslim public, Muslim scholars, and ulama and the other expert academics, because the idea behind this is not for this just to be a training course, but rather be something a lot bigger than that, so that we can dissipate some of this knowledge, even put it out in paper form, in hard copy, and give it out to people who have an interest in this area. So the course is on 3 levels. So the first level is mainly aimed at general public. So you don't need to really start off with a really in-depth science background or philosophical background, but rather what we'll be doing is slowly, gradually building you up in terms of your knowledge base, so that you can actually, those of you who are interested to learn more, can go on to level 2 and even more intensely level 3. And each particular part of the sessions will be divided into 3 components. So you'll have some reading material before a session, you'll have the actual interactive online class, and there'll be an opportunity for questions on in-depth subjects, and also post-class material as well, and even a little assessment at the end of it to sort of measure how much you've sort of picked up from this. Just to give you a bit of an insight, I know some of you may have seen the video, but just to give you a bit of an insight about some of the things that we will have. So we'll be talking about modernity, political, social, why be a Muslim's guide to science and scientism, reason, mind, God, and prophethood, Islam being the truth, the soul, and question of evil, and also how we should approach the Holy Quran, how should we interpret the Holy Quran. I get a lot of people ask questions regarding certain verses of the Holy Quran and how they can't seem to reconcile them, and the whole approach to the Holy Quran sometimes is not really correct. So there'll be a bit of discussion about that, also about secularism, and something about the power of Tawheed and the issue of Fitra, as Hamza talked about earlier on. So Jazakumullah khair again to the panelists, and Jazakumullah khair for yourselves for attending this webinar. Inshallah, there will be more. And please don't forget, register for this course. You'll find it very beneficial. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.